primary problems. Sorry, I wasn't, never mind. So I guess we are starting out with the primary problems and then who is defining this as a problem. So whoever wants to jump in and start.
I can jump in if that's fine. Christina, you're freezing up a little bit.
There's not a lot I can do about it.
Okay, it's okay. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't something on my end. Okay. Well, the first one that I talked about was that Abel, I think that's how you pronounce his name, he's experiencing a lot of difficulty coping with the loss of his biological mother. And I think a lot of that is trauma related, but I'm going to go into that as we talk about the theory. I think that can be exhibited by his explosive outbursts and aggression towards people and property per the case study. And he even seemed to kind of link this, like he seemed to be able to like make that connection during the mental status exam. I don't know if you guys read that. So he sort of defined that problem a little bit when discussing the emotional topics in that exam. And it wasn't clear to me who exactly was conducting that MSE. So kind of would want to know that, but I don't think we got that information in the case study. So did you want me to continue with 2 other problems, or do you guys just want to pick one problem out of the 3? Just so that everybody has a chance to go.
Yeah, I was thinking that one of the problems that was not being for Abel, and I pronounce it Abel. I don't know how to pronounce it, but that's in my mind. That's how it's been going. Is that his mental health needs just haven't been addressed, and that kind of puts his own physical safety and the safety of others around him at risk. And I think that problem has been sort of defined by his adoptive mother and sort of the social situations that he's been put in.
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure. So just, it doesn't matter, but just so you know, his name is pronounced Abel. But I called him Abel for years till I knew that.
Is he like a real live person, or is this just an? Oh, okay.
It is a real case, so it's somewhat disguised, including the country that he was adopted from in order to protect his identity.
One problem I wrote down comes from, I would say Abel would be who would identify this, is he had talked about wanting more contact with his family in Africa and more contact with his culture.
That was one I talked about too, was feeling like a loss of connection with his brother, especially, and who's still in Africa.
Yeah, I don't have any necessarily new thoughts that you haven't already shared, but I mean, I was thinking along the same lines, having trouble adapting to a new culture, being raised by a Caucasian woman, and then I mean, just the trauma of his past. I mean, I think that's huge. So, I mean, the loss of his biological mom and his younger sister.
Okay. Anybody else have anything to add to the primary problems, and who's defining them?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that he's, well, I think you guys touched really well upon the mental health challenges, but I also wanted to go in a little deeper about the substance abuse with marijuana and smoking cigarettes on a daily basis, because he doesn't really necessarily believe that the substance abuse is impacting his functionality, but his adoptive mother definitely is defining that problem, because she thinks that it's somehow prohibiting him from finishing or complete or like focusing on like schoolwork. So I felt like that was really emphasized towards the end of the case study.
Okay, so moving on, we're going to look at strengths, resources, resiliencies for the family, focusing, starting, I think we'll start with the identity, and then we'll move over to biological, and then psychological and social, and so on and so forth. That will make it easier.
So just a heads up for who's ever taking notes, while I fix the grid. Justin, can you mute, because I'm getting feedback. Thanks. While I fix the grid in terms of the environmental and political strengths, I should have fixed the grid for family resiliency factors, because those don't fall into those domains. So family resiliency factors are really coming out of that Walsh article from last week. And there's sort of 4 domains of family resilience: belief systems, organizational patterns, communication patterns, and communication and problem solving. So just treat that as one big box, not 6 or however many little boxes, 5 little boxes. I should have fixed that on it too. So just so when you have the discussion, just think about family resilience in general. So, you know.
Do you want the individual strengths broken out in those boxes still?
You know, the idea is I gave you the boxes. It's like, I was trying to be helpful, but I don't know how helpful it was. The idea was to sort of give you domains to think about, because I think it's really easy. Like I was just talking to a student, you know, half an hour ago, who said, I have a really hard time finding strengths. And so I was trying to give you smaller categories of areas to think about. And the thing to think about is what's not going wrong. You know, what are the areas that are going well, even if they don't go well all the time. So I'll just give you one. I think the fact that Abel, sometimes when he gets activated, leaves the house, one could see as a strength. He doesn't do it all the time, but we know he has the capacity to recognize that he needs to leave the scene. So the idea is my hope, and you know, that you can all tell me if it was not helpful, was to help you to identify strengths by giving you separate areas to think about. They overlap on some level. You know, the environmental and sociopolitical strengths overlap with the social. But I just wanted you to have as rich a discussion about what strengths might look like by having all the dimensions of a biopsychosocial history.
So feeding into that, then, if I'm looking at Abel's, just his identity, if we're going with the individual strengths, that first category there for identity, I would think that it's a really big strength for Abel that he wants to be more connected with his heritage and culture and his brother. So that would be kind of a strength of his we could put in that box.
I would say another strength of his is when he is not activated, he's very charismatic. One of his strengths, he talks about being able to communicate with others. So it's not all the time that he is struggling to get out what his thoughts are, what he's feeling. It's some of the time.
For strengths, I was thinking, well, one is his heritage. He seems really connected to his heritage, but also he has an understanding of his marijuana usage, and he doesn't want to be an addict, I guess, as he said. So he I guess is aware of his consumption of marijuana and limited alcohol use. And then also I think in the spiritual box, I mean, he is able to, despite, being taken from his culture and his country, kind of found his own way, even within an Orthodox Christian home. He kind of made his own thoughts and was able to express his own belief system and come to his own conclusions.
And I just want to say, as the note taker in the previous session, it really is helpful if, when you're identifying the strengths, if you just say like what category they run under for identity, biological, psychological, and spiritual and social. It just helps the note taker kind of organize all that instead of having to do that on the fly. And so I would say, just to go off of what Justin said, for the biological strength for him is the substance abuse he uses, but he's not like, it doesn't sound like he's like a daily chronic code, like chemically dependent. He's got some tendencies to use, but he's not, it doesn't seem like it's super out of control. So he has some ability, I think, to not use. So that would be a strength.
You guys took all my I mean, they do, like, I mean, as for like I guess this more goes into like community, but he is able to make creative and like different friendships from what the case study said, and there is some like positive feedback from his peers, and I think the fact that he's able to engage and participate in athletics such as soccer, I know that is a big deal in East Africa. Just from knowing a lot of friends from like Ethiopia and Somalia, like they're very into like soccer. Well, they call it football, but I think that that's definitely a strength of his, like when he's not activated, of course, but just wanted to kind of add that.
So Erica, if I was to say, frame that strength in the biological category, how would you frame it?
The biological category? Oh, I think
what you just said. What would be the strength if you were going to put it under biology?
Oh, I would say more like maybe emotional development. Like he's got a strong sense of like, I mean, the fact that he's able to make friends, I guess.
What about the soccer? I'm going at the soccer.
I don't think that fits in the biological. I think I wanted to put that into more like social.
So he's able-bodied.
Yeah.
He's not got disabilities. So, you know, he's actually able, he's physically able to participate. So that, you know, you in the biological piece, there's a ton of strengths in there because he's not got a chronic illness. He's able-bodied. He's healthy. You know, he's not. So I was just trying to push you to, I agree with you that playing soccer and making friends probably is the psychological, but there's another piece of that that's a strength, which if he wasn't able-bodied, he wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's a really good point. I didn't think of it that way.
I didn't either. And I think that's because, you know, I am able-bodied, and that's something that I take for granted to even think about it in that perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Okay. And I think maybe also in that biological category, then we could play off like he doesn't have any medical conditions that he's required to take, even if it's like diabetes, he's not on any kind of medication regimen. So his medical health, as far as I've read, is fairly stable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I talked about Helen and her coping skills because she identifies that sometimes when she gets frustrated, she knows that she's frustrated and tries to leave the situation to give Abel space when he needs it. And like she's able to utilize resources in the community. Like she's tried to reach out to DHS and she's tried to use the police and use interventions, though they haven't been super helpful in some of the situations. She's at least like reaching out and like trying to help Abel with what he's struggling with.
And I also put for Helen for the psychological category that she's open to boundary setting. So setting those boundaries with Abel, even if they're successful or not, she's open to the idea of that. And also when she like went out in her car, so she's actually worked on doing those things by going out in her car and sitting there, even though he came out to the car and jumped on the hood or whatnot. So she's acting on, I guess, boundaries. I don't know how else to say that. So that's what I thought for Helen in the psychological box.
Yeah, I had added to pretty much what you had said by saying how she had tried to incorporate routines, like even having chore charts and trying to add that aspect to Abel's and most likely his sister's, lifestyle as a strength. And then I had also put in there how she was at least attuned enough into Abel to notice that diet, sleep, and exercise has a huge impact on his mood. So that means that, she's listening. She notices him. She's paying attention to him. She's, seeing those things that, he's not saying, that I'm upset because I'm hungry. She's noticing the pattern.
And also for Helen and the psychological, I think when she reacted, it said that she had reacted in like self-defense against him when he was sort of coming at her. Just her being able to acknowledge those behaviors that she's doing, against Abel, I think is a really big, important piece of it. Not just that she's sort of this victim taking on all this, but she's also reacted in a way to protect herself. For the social parts for the family, for individual strength, I think a couple of folks have said it, just reaching out for the support, even if the support isn't given back. She's actively like trying to better her family and address the behaviors with Abel and not just sort of pushing him off on the system. She wants to be part of it, and I think that's a really big strength for her.
I had another thought. I'm not sure what box I'm kind of leaning towards social or psychological, but I think it says something that he leaves the house frequently, but he always returns, and so I feel like there's some sense of family connection. I don't know if it's with the whole family or his sisters. I'm not sure, but I think that says something about him, and that he doesn't just run away and leave. He always comes back.
Molly, do you feel everything needed for that section? Yeah. Okay, so
The only thing I might add is in the identity section is there's a certain amount of privilege that Helen has in being white, and also just based on what you've got in the case, there's some assumptions that she's financially secure. So again, that is a strength, that there is housing, there is, stable housing. She clearly has a car. So those are other things to think about in terms of strengths in her, in the family, in the system. I'm about to leave you and go to the other group. There are a couple things that I want to throw out for you to, when you get later down. And part of it is I'm telling you this because not a lot of students know this, but it's a really critical thing to think about, which is in Abel's country of origin, if he was living in a family in which he was at the age, I think, what is he, 16? I can't remember now. What is it? What is he? Somebody tell me. Is he 16, 17? I can't
15.
Oh, 15. Okay, 15. So in his country of origin, as a 15-year-old male, if he was living in a household of women, he would actually be considered the head of the household. And he would actually be expected to carry on a lot of the responsibilities for caring for the members of the household. So that's a really important thing to think about as you talk about, you know, what are the cultural factors that might be influencing it. The other thing when you talk about theory is, I think it's oftentimes with this case, students tend to think about attachment theory and to argue that you know, that attachment theory might help us to think that he's actually got an unstable attachment style just based on the loss of his mother, the loss of his sister, the loss of his country, all of that. And I would argue that this isn't, you know, this isn't attachment. This is trauma. And but I think it's really easy to get confused when you're looking at a kid like this, to think, oh, this must be attachment. But pretty much, I can't remember how old he was when his mother died. He had a pretty stable family experience for the first part of his life. And I think what we're seeing is more trauma related. So, I mean, when you talk about the theories, it's just, again, you can disagree with me, but it's something to think about. And I think that's why working with kids like this is really tough, because attachment and trauma look really similar. And yet, well, and some of the intervention is the same. So those are just some pieces I wanted to put in for you as you continue the discussion. Any questions for me before I leave?
Not that I can think of.
Okay, it's good to see you all. I'll see you later.
Okay, so moving on to cultural factors. So I think we'll probably start with.
Did we do?
Yeah, we need to do the environmental and socio-political strengths first. And then it's cultural factors.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm
Well, I'm sure
skipping.
I missed something. No, you're fine.
No. Well, in one part of the, like in the paper where it talks about what we need to do is different than the grid.
Mm-hmm.
So I was looking off of the paper and then I realized I was skipping over a whole box on the grid. So we'll back up to the box on the grid for environmental and socio-political strengths. So I guess I'll start. I put Abel is continuing to adjust to Western culture and his role in a as a non-dominant in society. He recognizes a lack of attachment to his culture and something he wants to work on and build. Struggles. Abel recognizes his struggles with identifying his triggers and how that affects his ability to move forward. And then verbalizing his feelings that school officials treat him different than other students. Anybody else who wants to jump in?
I mean, I had kind of a hard time with this one. I didn't really come up with a whole lot. And we're talking about socioeconomic, right? And you know, yeah, I mean, I mean, from what Sarah said, it sounds like he's maybe has some financial stability in his home. I didn't gather that from it, so I didn't want to make that assumption. But based on what she was saying, it sounds like he does have some stability, and he probably has all of his basic needs met, and probably some extra. Probably.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just same thing. Yeah, just that he was, he at least has some access to sports and to equipment needed and stuff like that.
Yeah, I said the same thing as you did, just because, I mean, you can kind of infer that there's some consistent stream of income. Like it wasn't like clear, like as to what she does for an occupation. But I mean, they do have that ability to access like resources in their community. Like the hospitalization, like the psychiatric care, I know that that is it can be expensive. I'm not sure if they went through insurance or not, but it sounds like that could have been costly for them. I also, because when I think of environment, I just think of like the white dominant culture that Helen could possibly be like implicitly promoting, like in the household. And so I talked about like pre-existing biases and thoughts, like in order to work with her son Abel, especially with behavior change, because I think sometimes too, there's this, it's not exactly like racial profiling, but the perception of anger can be very different in cultures. Like just because you're speaking in a loud voice doesn't mean that you're angry. It can just mean that you're excited or animated. And so I kind of talked about that, I guess. And I don't know if I just misinterpreted it or maybe it's more cultural factors in that sense. But I think that he could also be facing that in school, where maybe these behaviors just look behaviors because it's being defined by probably white dominant educators, is my guess. And it's like a lot of the like norms, it's like, well, who gets to decide what's appropriate, you know? And the whole thing with like anger too, it's like, why not just let him discuss why he's feeling this way? Because anger is not necessarily like a bad thing. I think that it's just a natural emotion. And we don't really know what that's looking like, I guess, specifically like with the interventions at school, like aside from the alternative school programs. But I know a lot of them are, like, I know a lot of those programs are designed with like white supremacist ideology. So I guess that's like more what I talked about. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. I talked about that under the cultural factors more than like the environmental strengths, though.
And I think like it's not like I would agree it's more like cultural factors, but I think that like maybe Abel recognizes that there's some kind of like disconnect, I think is like a strength almost, because I don't think a lot of students may be able to like recognize that, just because there's a lot of like internalized oppression that can happen with people of color. But I'm not sure. Maybe I like blurred the lines a little bit on that, and I apologize.
She said that there was going to be a lot of fluidity between the different areas. So I think we're good. One thing I was thinking about when you guys were talking about the schools and the alternative placements was it said that he had been in multiple alternative programs, which to me would mean he's in a city that has multiple programs for him to access. So he's in a decent enough area that would have, you know, all these different places that he could go. If it didn't work out at this place, then he has another place to try. In our city, we have one alternative ed program, and that's it. If you don't do it at that, you're dropping out of school. So
and I think that could also, that like you bring up a good point, and I think that really goes to show that there's probably a lot more wealth perhaps in this like particular school district, because I know that it can take a lot of funding to have like multiple alternative like school programs, and maybe that does show there is a higher income white population in this particular area, or maybe there's just a big need for it. But that's interesting that you bring that up.
Or even the fact that he's able to do soccer and like soccer. And it sounded like soccer was attached to school. Mm-hmm. Well, if you're doing soccer in school, you have to have a certain GPA in order to be able to do it.
Right.
So there's a strength there as well, that even though he's, you know, struggling at school, he's at least doing well enough to keep I want to say it's like a 2 or a 2.5 GPA in order to play.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also a strength in the sense that like soccer is very ingrained in East African culture. So I think it's like another way for him to be connected to his heritage a bit.
Mm-hmm.
They're in Portland, is what the case study said. It's a family from Portland.
Well, then makes sense why there's so many resources available. They're not in rural Madras.
Yeah, but even though all these resources are available, like he's never been put on a formal IEP, which I found to be interesting. Like there's never been that consistency or follow through within the school districts from him bouncing around. And I know this is all strengths, but that's interesting to me that it's gotten to this point where he's been through so many schools, but an IEP hasn't been established.
I talked about that with the cultural factors and kind of tying it into like what Erica talked about with how like the dominant like white culture sees African Americans as like aggressive and like the behaviors he's exhibiting. Well, like if it was a white kid who is doing this, would they have been on him on an IEP already versus Abel who's presenting as an African American who's not on an IEP yet? So like talked about that with the cultural factors.
Do we want to move into cultural factors now? Or do we think we have enough for environmental and sociopolitical?
Yeah. So moving on.
You know, one thing that, you know, throws me off. So, and I'm just throwing this out there, but we do have an East African boy, but we have a white mother. So there's going to be barriers inherently against our East African child, but does the fact that he has a Caucasian mother, an advocate, someone who's going out there and trying to get him access to the services, sort of, does it lessen that, I don't know what it's called, but I can't think of the word right now, but does it lessen the oppression that he feels because he has a white mother, or does it still stay the same? So can she access more services that maybe a black mother wouldn't be able to do, even though she's raising a black child? So it was a thought I had. I don't know. So that would be maybe a cultural factor that could need further exploration.
I got it.
Okay.
One. Oh, go ahead, Justin.
Oh, okay. Well, when I was reading the case study, it sounds like his mom expressed that he has maybe a disrespect for women, and I don't know if that is cultural or if it's something he's learned in his upbringing. So exploring maybe the root of that, if it is something to do with his cultural upbringing and that he sees himself as the head of the household, or if it's just something that he's picked up over the years. Or even if there's any validity to it, you know, maybe that's just the mom's interpretation because that's how he treats her.
Yeah, that's something I had also put in on, was saying further exploration of the cultural differences and how he views his place in society, his home, and at school. And then further exploration to how Abel is treated different at school, because he had made that statement that they treat him differently. Like, what does he mean by that? You know, what are some examples would be helpful in understanding, you know, maybe there is racial things that are happening, and if that's so, then that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, he's just continuing to feel invalidated and not heard.
Yeah, I agree with all of you. I mean, I don't know if you guys went over the iceberg of culture yet in your classes, where it's like surface culture and then it's like deep. Okay, So surface culture is just like language, you know, like that kind of thing. But then it's like deep culture is more like norms, beliefs, and values, and like perceptions. And so I really talked about exploring, like for further exploration, like exploring more about his upbringing in East Africa and like the role of a man and son, kind of like what Sarah was saying, because at least like in Japan, for example, the role of a man, like there's it's a very big, it's something that's celebrated, like masculinity is very celebrated. And I'm just wondering maybe if that's coming off as like disrespectful towards women from Helen's point of view, because like what I was saying before, she's sort of using this, she's using a lot of her perception and it's coming a lot from like white dominant culture. So I feel like that really, like the views of masculinity should really be explored. And there's maybe some adjustment to his role here in the United States, because maybe people his age in East Africa, like maybe they don't go to school, like maybe they're already working and supporting the family. Of course, we don't know that, but that could definitely be a contributing factor. I also was, yeah, like talking about more culturally responsive services for Abel, like in these alternative school programs, just knowing that like a lot of like EBPs, like aggression replacement therapy, that's typically used with like juvenile delinquents or at-risk youth, like that has had a lot of criticism for being dominated in white supremacy because it was designed by white men. So it tells you a lot, and maybe that's why he feels like he's being treated differently. And maybe the views of mental health in East African culture, views of substance abuse, and like what that relationship with his mother looks like, I think in East Africa would be really good to explore.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to bring up his sisters because I don't think we've talked about them much, but I think like what is his relationship like with his sisters? Is it different based on the same, they're both Black and his mom is white, so is there something different that's occurring there, like the dynamics of those relationships? So I think that's something that could be explored a little bit more. And I think with the mom, clearly she sought out children from a different country to adopt and integrate into her family. So what did she do on before that adoption finalized to sort of give her a better understanding of the culture that she's adopting from and what the needs of those children are going to be? And so what's her understanding of what the kids actually need and where their values and belief systems sort of align. Yeah.
Erica, you had spoke about the disciplinary ways that like a school, you know, looks at discipline. And it got me thinking about part of what Helen was saying was maybe she should have disciplined differently when he was younger, or she needs to find different ways to discipline him. And I thought it would be beneficial to know, what does discipline look like in the culture that he comes from? Does that come from the mother? Does that come from, you know, maybe his older brother took on the father role in the household and maybe it came from him. So it could be completely foreign to him having this woman be the disciplinarian. So
Yeah, I mean that brings up a really good point, because I think in East Asian culture it's often the father that disciplines, it's not the mother. And so yeah, really good point there. I think we should definitely add that.
did everyone get a chance to speak on that? Yes. Okay, then it's time to move on to theories. Okay.
I'm sorry, did we have enough information in the family resilience? Did you capture all that?
it was all kind of jumbled together between individual and family. So I just kind of wrote it as one section.
Okay.
I think that's what she had said, that it really should have been blocked out as individual strengths and family resilience should have been all, at least that's what I was understanding.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I thought she meant family resilience didn't need to be broken up into all those little categories, and it could have just been one fluid line like the ones below it on the grid. And I thought,
that may be what she meant too.
I don't know. What
I
does
don't
everyone
know.
think?
I don't know. My brain doesn't work in like the grid form. Yeah. So we got it though. I'll separate it out.
Okay.
And I can make it a Google Doc again like you did, so we can all edit it.
Because I think I wrote on the little chat that I think I'll do the cultural identity theory, because I think that might play into this family a lot. I don't know super ton about it, but I did print out the all the theories that everybody in our cohort wrote up. And so just kind of looking through that as we've been chatting, I thought, well, this is probably applicable. So I think I'll go with that one, and then put it on the Google Doc, sort of how it applies. And if for some reason it changes, I'll just wipe that one out and put a different theory. And you all can look at it if that works, unless you guys want something different.
That sounds fine. Do you want to start and talk about that theory? Your
Okay.
eyes got really big, so do you want to go last?
Well, so I basically was just looking at this, and I thought it really sort of applied to Bell and sort of like his culture identity. It's something he really wants to explore, and I think that it's been abandoned since he came here. It doesn't mention within any of the case study that his adoptive mother is practicing any of the rituals or the belief systems that he grew up for 10 years with, which is a huge portion of your life. And it sounds like he had a fairly stable childhood until his mom passed away very suddenly. So he probably really believed in those values, and so that's important to him and who he is as a person in his existence. So it kind of sets him out to be like how he exists in the world. And so if he believes, I can't even imagine, but coming from East Africa to Portland, Oregon, it would be a very much of a culture shock. And so how do you react to that? And I think he's reacting probably pretty negatively to that because he doesn't know how else to react. So I think those things really influence his current behavior on how he's acting, and maybe if we incorporated some of his cultural identity into his lifestyle, maybe that might improve his mood, his behaviors, his how he responds to his mother, how he responds to his peers. So that's kind of what I got from cultural identity, just reading through the paperwork.
Nice. I'll go next with the psychosocial development theory. As I was looking at it and I was thinking about how the stage that he's at right now would be the identity versus confusion stage, where the teenager is working at refining a sense of the self by testing out roles and then integrating them into a single identity, or they become confused about who they are. And as I was thinking about this, I'm like, oh, this totally applies because he's a teenager and they're all trying to figure out who they are and they're trying on different personas. And then I got thinking about how, well, that's what most white teenagers are doing. And how does this theory apply to Abel, who is a person of color? And is it as applicable as you first think that it is? And I think that it is still applicable, but more so in the fact that he would be trying to assimilate into white culture. So because this is what his peers are doing, then he feels like this is what he should be doing. And then Sarah was saying that in his culture right now, he would be becoming the head of the household, having more of that responsibility type role that most of our teenagers here in America don't really take on that role in the same way. So then that would form a type of conflict with him trying to fit in with what the dominant culture is doing at this time and what he's trying to do at this time as well. So next.
I can go next. So I was thinking of cognitive development theory, which is that there's kind of 4 stages of development in childhood. And I think, I mean, in his, I guess, age right now, he should be in the last stage, the formal operational stage. But I'm thinking, he sounds like he had a really traumatic childhood in Africa. So there was a lot of trauma there. And then even more trauma moving to Oregon and new family, new culture. So all the trauma, I think, has affected him and his stages of development. So it's probably pretty likely that he hasn't reached the stage that he's supposed to be in biologically. So I think maybe emotionally he's behind. He's not. So his emotional intelligence doesn't necessarily match his biological age, and so he's wrestling with a lot of emotions, but he's doing it at a stage that he should have probably moved past if he would have had a healthy and less traumatic upbringing.
I can go next. I think Justin really hit it really well with the trauma. Because I selected trauma theory. I thought it was really relevant to this case. And I guess with the Bell, he's experienced so many traumatic events. Like you were saying, Justin, he witnessed his own biological mother passing away. And then there was also mention of his younger sister passing away too. I don't know if he directly witnessed that, but I feel like that's very traumatic for a child that doesn't necessarily developmentally like understand like end of life or really what death means. And it could be possible that Abel is experiencing some form of PTSD with his aggressive behaviors. And I know that in trauma-informed care, like we learned that sometimes these behaviors can be ways to replicate past forms of trauma, like in an attempt to seek like a sense of control. And his brain is on constant alert, and there's likely like a neurological imbalance in his adrenaline levels that are causing him to act more aggressively towards others because he's constantly in this like flight or fight mode. And I think that when working with them, it's like really important, like providing safety and building trust and transparency. And I'm just not sure. Yeah, and in addition to making it culturally responsive too, because we also don't want to be misperceiving his behaviors, because we don't want to be the ones that are defining that from like a white dominant view. But yeah, definitely some signs of trauma in this case.
Okay, so I will talk about labeling theory. I think this one plays a pretty big part in what he's experiencing. I talked about him being labeled as aggressive and deviant, and how kind of going back to like how the school is treating him with the IEP, like he's being labeled a certain way potentially because of being like African American. and how once he's been labeled as aggressive and or as like having behavioral problems, that's going to follow him throughout the rest of his schooling. And I just lost train of thought. Sorry. But yeah, being labeled as certain things, especially from a younger age, and even like labeling him as having trauma or PTSD is definitely going to play a part in how he views himself as well. And if he's being labeled as really different from like the get-go, he's probably going to like start to view himself as different, and then that's like going to internalize, and like he's going to have a harder time probably coming to terms with who he actually is, if that makes sense. I don't know that I just made a lot of sense there, but I think it's pretty obvious that like even Helen's labeled him as aggressive or like high behaviors, and the schools have obviously labeled him as aggressive and having high behaviors because they keep shuffling him around to different alternative schools, and they're not taking the chance to actually like really get to know him and figure out what's causing those behaviors. And then the fact that he's already spent time like in a psych hospital is kind of, even though he doesn't have an official diagnosis, that's already kind of labeling him as having like a mental illness. Yes, that's what I have.
Hey, anything that anybody else feels like we want to add? Otherwise, I believe we have covered just about everything.
No, I think we're good. We're probably good to stop the recording and wrap it up.
Okay.
Do you want to